"Excuse me, Professor. I believe there is an error in line 3 of your proof." The room went dead silent. 300 people turned to stare at the young black woman standing in the back row. Professor Arthur Pendleton did not even look up from the board. "Security lets anyone into the gallery these days." He turned slowly. "Let me guess. Virginia sharecropper background. You smell like a 4-day steam train ride in a Jim Crow car. Sit down before you embarrass yourself further." A graduate student next to her grabbed his leather satchel and moved 2 seats away. The front row laughed. Someone adjusted their pocket watch with a quiet click. A woman in the 3rd row whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Who let a field hand in here?" Not one person stood up for her. Not one. But every single person in that lecture hall was about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Man, they really underestimated her. Let us see how this plays out. To understand what happened next, you need to understand where this story takes place. A prestigious northern university in the year 1932, during the height of the Great Depression, one of the most exclusive academic institutions on the planet. And inside that institution, there was a man who believed he owned every stone in the foundation. Professor Arthur Pendleton, 61 years old, tenured professor of mathematics, chair of the Department of Applied Mathematics, fellow of the American Mathematical Society, author of a graduate textbook cited over 14,000 times. His grandfather was a dean. His father was a professor. Arthur Pendleton did not earn his place at the university. He inherited it. Every autumn, the university hosted a 2-week event called the Pendleton Distinguished Lecture Series in Applied Mathematics. Read that name again. The lecture series was named after his family, funded by his family endowment, organized by him, judged by him. It was his absolute kingdom. The event brought together the best graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, and visiting scholars from across the country. On the final days, there was a public competition. 4 rounds of increasing difficulty. Participants solved problems on a slate chalkboard in front of a live audience. A panel of 3 judges scored each round. After each round, the lowest scorers were eliminated. The winner received 2 things: a public commendation from the university and a personal letter of recommendation from Professor Pendleton. For most people in that room, that letter was a nice bonus. For the woman standing in the back row, it was everything. Her name was Clara Sullivan, 22 years old, born and raised in rural Virginia during the darkest days of racial segregation. Her mother, Lydia Kennedy, worked tobacco fields for 20 years to buy discarded textbooks from a local segregated school. They never had much. Some weeks they did not have enough food to cover the kitchen table. Clara taught herself advanced calculus and tensor theory, not at a private academy, not with a private tutor. She used discarded textbooks with torn covers and worked out long derivations using charcoal on scrap wood behind their cabin. She worked through the same mathematical problems over and over until the complex concepts stopped being confusing and started being completely obvious. She earned a scholarship to Howard University, graduated summa cum laude with a double major in pure mathematics and philosophy, top student in her department. She looked up to pioneers like Elbert Frank Cox, the first black person in the world to earn a doctorate in mathematics. Then she applied to doctoral programs at every elite institution in the North. Every single one rejected her. The letters were polite. They all said the same thing: not the right fit. No explanation, no feedback, just a closed door with a polite brass plaque on it. So Clara took a job teaching basic arithmetic at a community center in Washington. She saved pennies. She waited. And when she heard about the Pendleton Lecture Series with open public auditing, she bought a ticket for the Jim Crow car of a northbound train. 4 days breathing coal dust in a cramped wooden car, a cotton bag with 2 changes of clothes, a room in a segregated boarding house 6 miles from campus, run by an elderly black porter named Isaac Fisher, cold gas station biscuits for dinner. She did not come to make friends. She came because that letter could open every door that had been slammed in her face. But from the moment she walked into the auditorium, the room made one thing clear: she was not welcome. It was not just Arthur Pendleton. It was everything. The oil paintings on the walls, all aristocrats. The mahogany seats filled with young men who greeted each other by their family titles. The way people looked at her faded cotton dress and then looked away. A staff member near the double doors asked if she was there to scrub the floors before the afternoon session. During the first 2 days, Clara sat in the very last row of the gallery and took meticulous notes. She watched how Pendleton treated different people. When wealthy white students asked questions, he leaned forward, he engaged, he smiled. When a visiting scholar from a southern black college asked a question, he paused. He rephrased it condescendingly. More precisely, he said, then answered his own simplified version. He did not smile once. A graduate student named Julian Brooks sat near Clara on day 2. He turned to his companion and said loud enough for her to hear, "I did not know they gave gallery passes to domestic workers." His friend chuckled softly. Clara did not react. She kept writing in her worn notebook. That night, alone in her drafty room at the boarding house, she read the competition rules one more time on a printed handbill. 4 rounds open to all participants, judged on correctness, elegance, and speed. She closed her notebook and stared at the water-stained ceiling. She had not traveled through 4 states in a segregated train car to sit in the back row and remain invisible. But Clara did not know that the hardest part was not entering the hall. It was what Professor Arthur Pendleton had already planned for anyone who dared to challenge the natural order of his kingdom. Day 3 arrived. Professor Arthur Pendleton stood at the front of the grand lecture hall, a piece of white chalk in his hand, working through an advanced proof involving differential equations. His writing was fast, sharp, and confident. Every line flowed into the next like he had performed this demonstration 1,000 times. The room was deathly quiet. 300 people watched in absolute reverence. But Clara was not watching with reverence. She was watching with razor-sharp focus. Her eyes moved from line 1 to line 2. Perfect. Line 2 to line 3. She stopped instantly. She tilted her head slightly to the left. She looked down at her notebook. She looked back at the large slate board. She double-checked her own handwritten lines. In line 3, Pendleton had distributed a negative sign across a complex binomial term, but he had completely missed the second variable. The sign should have been positive, not negative. It was a minor structural error, the kind that most tired observers would overlook during a long lecture. But Clara was not most observers. She could already see the disastrous domino effect down the entire derivation. That one wrong sign flipped the inequality in line 5, which completely collapsed the upper bound in line 8, which meant the grand final conclusion was totally invalid. She raised her right hand. Pendleton did not even glance toward the back gallery. He scanned the front rows, pointed his finger at a favored doctoral candidate sitting in the second row, and took his question instead. The student asked something about practical applications in civil engineering. Pendleton smiled warmly and answered at length. They exchanged polite academic pleasantries like old peers. Clara's hand remained steady in the air. Pendleton finally allowed his eyes to drift toward the back of the dark gallery. His warm smile vanished instantly. Yes, the spectator in the back. Not her name, not Miss Sullivan, not the woman in the back. A spectator, an intrusion, a category, not a human being. Clara stood up and prepared to speak. "Professor, in the third line of your proof," he held up one flat hand and cut her off before she could finish the sentence. "I will take questions from enrolled university participants first. If there is time remaining at the conclusion, auditors may submit their inquiries in writing to the department clerk." He turned his back to the gallery and picked up his chalk again. Conversation over. The lecture hall was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from respect, but the kind that comes from deep social tension. A few students in the front row exchanged amused glances. Julian Brooks crossed his arms and smirked. A woman sitting 3 rows down whispered. She actually believed she belonged in this room. Eleanor King, a distinguished black educator and visiting scholar sitting near the middle aisle, gripped her wooden purse so hard her knuckles turned pale. She looked up at Clara with an expression that clearly pleaded, "Let it go, child, it is not safe." But Clara Sullivan did not let it go. She looked at the board covered in white equations. She looked at the man who had just reduced her life to a lower status. She looked at 300 people who had already decided she possessed nothing worth listening to, and she raised her hand again. This time, the entire hall took notice. Not because they supported her courage, but because they were shocked by her audacity. The way a crowd grows dead silent when someone walks toward the edge of a high rooftop. Julian Brooks turned all the way around in his seat. Several senior professors stopped writing in their pads. Even Pendleton felt the shift in the room's atmosphere. He turned around slowly. He knew everyone was watching. If he ignored her a second time, it would make him look defensive. If he let her speak, she would inevitably stumble, which would permanently prove his point about lower institutions. He let out a heavy sigh, the tired sigh of a nobleman granting an unearned favor to a beggar. "Fine. Say what you have to say and be brief. Clara stood tall in the back gallery. She did not step forward into the aisle. She did not move down the wooden stairs. She stood exactly where she was and spoke in a voice that was calm, clear, resonance-filled, and absolutely steady. In line 3, when you distributed the negative sign across the binomial expression, the second term was calculated as negative when it should have been positive. She paused, not for dramatic flair, but because she was giving every mathematician in the hall time to re-examine the chalk marks. That single error changes the directional inequality in line 5, which means the boundary limit you asserted in line 8 is mathematically impossible. Then she sat right back down. That was all. 3 precise sentences. No long explanation, no nervous hesitation, no polite softening phrases. She simply declared what the mathematics demanded and took her seat. The hall did not react right away. There was an absolute, heavy silence. Not a polite silence, nor a respectful one. It was the intense silence of 300 trained minds performing rapid calculations simultaneously. Every head in the auditorium turned toward the front board. Eyes tracked up to line 3. Ink pens traced the negative distribution in midair. Lips moved silently in the dim light, recalculating the steps. One by one, the realization spread across the room like a cold draft. She was completely right. The sign was wrong. The inequality in line 5 collapsed like a house of cards. The upper bound in line 8 was totally invalid. The entire grand conclusion, the very proof that a world-renowned department chair had just written with supreme authority, was built on a fundamental mistake that a 22-year-old black woman from rural Virginia had spotted in under 2 minutes. It took the audience about 10 seconds to process the mathematics. It took Professor Arthur Pendleton about 3 seconds. He knew he was wrong before anyone else did. You could see it in the sudden stillness of his chalk hand. You could see it in the way his jaw tightened into a rigid line before he slowly turned back to face the auditorium. Arthur Pendleton had spent over 3 decades establishing his reputation as an untouchable titan of American mathematics. He had published dozens of papers, built an entire department in his family image, and commanded absolute obedience from every student and instructor who walked through those heavy oak doors. But in that frozen moment, staring at the white chalk dust on his sleeve, he felt the ground beneath his boots begin to shift. He cleared his throat, a deliberate, slow sound designed to project effortless control. He turned his body toward the audience, placing his hands behind his back, and offered a tight, thin smile that barely reached his eyes. "An interesting observation," he said, his voice echoing off the high plaster ceiling. "The sign in line 3 is indeed reversed due to a minor notation slip. However, as any serious mathematician in this hall understands, a mere sign convention does not materially alter the underlying structure or the final conclusion of the proof. That statement was an absolute, deliberate falsehood, and every single person in that auditorium with a graduate education knew it was a falsehood. The sign error did not simply tweak a minor detail, it completely inverted the directional boundary conditions, rendering the final inequality mathematically meaningless. Pendleton was making a calculated, dangerous gamble. He was betting that 32 years of institutional authority, a prestigious family surname, and the deeply ingrained social hierarchies of 1932 would outweigh the absolute truth of a chalkboard equation written by a young black woman from Virginia. For his entire life, that bet had paid off without question. But mathematics is a cold, indifferent arbiter. Across the front row, Julian Brooks slowly pulled a brass fountain pen from his breast pocket and opened his leather-bound journal. He looked up at the third line, then down at his paper, and began tracing the algebraic expansion step by step. Next to him, a senior postdoctoral researcher did the same. Then another student, 2 rows behind them, pulled out a small pad. Within 15 seconds, the rhythmic, scratchy sound of steel nibs and graphite pencils moving across paper filled the quiet hall. Nobody spoke a word aloud. Nobody needed to. The sudden, frantic checking of his work by his own students was the most devastating judgment possible. Pendleton stood under the warm hanging lanterns and watched his star pupils verify that he had lied to cover a basic mistake, and that the woman he had dismissed as a domestic worker had caught what he had missed. The narrator inside the hall could feel the air grow heavy. Pendleton had not completely lost his authority yet, but for the first time in his long career, the aura of absolute perfection was broken. At the elevated judges' table near the front, another dynamic was unfolding. Professor Eleanor King, sitting beside two elderly male department heads, tilted her head slightly as she examined the third line. Eleanor King was a pioneer in her own right, one of the extremely few black women of that era to hold an advanced degree in mathematics and serve as a prominent visiting educator from Howard University. She adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up at Clara sitting motionless in the high gallery, and then looked down at her leather journal. With a smooth, quiet stroke of her pen, Eleanor King wrote 2 words in her private ledger. Check her. She did not raise her voice. She did not cause a scene. She simply recorded the truth and waited. When the morning lecture officially adjourned for the midday recess, the auditorium erupted into a hushed wave of murmurs. Students gathered in tight clusters near the double exits, talking in low, urgent tones. Eleanor King stepped out into the grand marble hallway and spotted Clara making her way toward the heavy exit doors, carrying her worn cotton bag. Eleanor walked up beside her, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Do you have any idea what you just did in there, child?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice low so the passing scholars would not overhear. Clara paused near the grand archway, her expression calm, her eyes clear. "I pointed out a missing positive sign in a third-line derivation. Ma'am." Eleanor looked at her with a mix of profound concern and intense admiration. "You did not just point out a sign error. You pointed out a sign error to Arthur Pendleton in the lecture series named after his grandfather, inside a building funded by his family, in front of 300 people who believe this campus belongs exclusively to them." Clara's posture remained perfectly straight, but her eyes darkened with a quiet, resolute intensity. "The math does not care about his grandfather, Professor King. It only cares about what is true." Eleanor let out a soft, knowing breath. "That may be true on paper, Clara, but the men who run these institutions care very much about who is allowed to be right. Be careful. He will not let this stand." When the recess ended and the audience filed back into the auditorium, the atmosphere inside the room was visibly altered. The polite, predictable rhythm of the morning had vanished, replaced by an electric, uneasy tension. People who had completely ignored Clara earlier were now stealing subtle, sideways glances at her as she walked back up to the gallery. It was not friendliness or respect yet. It was a sharp, uncomfortable curiosity, the sudden realization that they had fundamentally misjudged the quiet woman in the faded dress. At 2 o'clock, Arthur Pendleton stepped back up to the wooden podium. His demeanor was once again smooth, polished, and impeccably controlled. He raised his hands to quiet the room and made an unexpected announcement. In the spirit of open academic debate and traditional scholarly rigor, he announced, his resonant voice filling the hall, "The university has decided to adjust the entry parameters for this afternoon's Pendleton Distinguished Challenge. Registration for the public competition will be expanded. All individuals present in this hall, including those auditing from the gallery, are formally invited to register as active contestants." Pendleton turned his head slowly toward the back of the room, looking directly up at Clara. He offered a warm, expansive smile, the kind of patronizing smile a wealthy gentleman gives when he is setting an inescapable trap. "After all," Pendleton added, his tone dripping with subtle sarcasm, "if our guest from the gallery possesses such an extraordinary eye for minor errors, I am certain she will find our timed problem-solving rounds exceptionally stimulating." A collective ripple of nervous laughter passed through the front rows. Julian Brooks smirked and adjusted his suit jacket. They all understood what Pendleton was doing. He was not honoring her. He was publicly daring her to step down onto the floor, where he could subject her to impossible pressure and crush her reputation in front of every scholar in the region. Clara did not hesitate. She did not blink, nor did she look down at her worn boots. She met Pendleton's gaze from across the vast room and gave a single, firm nod. She was in. But what Clara Sullivan did not know, as she picked up her notebook and prepared to descend the gallery stairs, was that Arthur Pendleton had already begun restructuring the contest parameters behind closed doors to guarantee that no outsider would ever leave that stage victorious. By 3 o'clock, the main floor of the lecture hall had been completely rearranged into a formal arena. The wooden lecture desk was pushed aside, replaced by a massive slate chalkboard that spanned 15 feet across the front wall. A long table for the 3 official judges was set up on the right side of the stage. The first 2 rows of seats were cleared and reserved for the 12 official competitors. The remaining 300 seats were packed shoulder to shoulder with spectators, while dozens of late arrivals stood 3 deep along the back wall. Clara walked down the center aisle and took her seat in the first row. She was a striking contrast to the 11 young men sitting around her. While they wore tailored 3-piece suits, polished leather shoes, and carried fine brass-clasped portfolios, Clara wore a simple, hand-mended dark cotton dress, her hair pulled back neatly, carrying a worn cloth bag containing 3 stubs of chalk and a notebook filled with charcoal calculations. 11 of the competitors were hand-picked doctoral fellows from elite Ivy League programs. The 12th was a Virginia sharecropper's daughter who had learned her arithmetic on scrap wood behind a cabin. The competition rules were straightforward, yet brutal. 4 distinct rounds of increasing technical complexity. For each round, an original mathematical problem would be written on the large slate board. Participants would have a strict time limit to work out their derivations on individual slates, then present their final proofs to the judging table. Scoring was based on 3 strict criteria: absolute logical correctness, structural elegance, and overall speed. After each round, the lowest scoring contestants would be immediately eliminated. The final round would be an intense, one-on-one, head-to-head match. Arthur Pendleton stepped to the center of the stage, picked up a fresh stick of chalk, and wrote the problem for round 1 across the top of the slate. It was an advanced optimization problem, a complex variant of what modern theorists call the network assignment problem, involving the distribution of constrained resources across a non-linear structural system. The timer was set for 15 minutes. The moment Pendleton stepped back, the 11 male contestants grabbed their chalk and began working frantically. They immediately relied on the standard academic technique taught in advanced European textbooks, a long, tedious algorithmic method involving row-by-row matrix reduction. Julian Brooks worked with practiced mechanical efficiency, his chalk clicking against his slate board in rapid succession. Clara did not touch her chalk for the first 45 seconds. She sat perfectly still in her chair, her deep brown eyes scanning the symbols on the board. While the others saw a standard matrix problem that required long, brute force arithmetic, Clara saw something entirely different. Her years of studying fundamental mathematical structures without formal guidance had given her a rare, intuitive clarity. She recognized that the underlying graph of the problem possessed a rare, hidden bipartite symmetry. Instead of forcing the calculation through 20 steps of matrix reduction like everyone else, Clara reframed the entire problem. She mapped the system into a dual network flow problem, turning a massive matrix calculation into a simple, elegant geometric balance. She stood up, walked calmly to her assigned section of the wallboard, and began to write. Her chalk moved in smooth, continuous curves. Her solution required less than half the lines of the standard method. While the other men were sweating over rows of complex numbers, Clara reached the final step, boxed her answer, and laid her chalk down on the tray. She had finished first, not by a few seconds, but by nearly 5 full minutes. Julian Brooks finished second, his face flushed red from the frantic pace. His answer was correct, but his board was covered in messy, chaotic calculations that took up 4 times as much space. The 3 judges stepped up to examine the boards. Eleanor King examined Clara's work with sharp, appreciative eyes, a faint smile gracing her lips. She recognized the sheer brilliant originality of the mapping. When the scores for round 1 were calculated, Clara received the highest marks of any contestant, placing firmly in first place. Julian Brooks took second. Pendleton, sitting in the front row of the audience, did not applaud. His face remained totally impassive, but his right hand gripped his mahogany walking stick until his knuckles turned white. A quiet murmur swept through the audience. Students who had openly mocked Clara 2 hours earlier were now leaning forward in their seats, watching her every move with intense focus. During the short break before round 2, Arthur Pendleton quietly approached the judging table while the auditorium was noisy with chatter. He leaned over the wood and spoke in a hushed, persuasive tone to the senior judges, suggesting that for the subsequent rounds, the problem selections should shift toward deep theoretical topology, specifically niche topics that were currently being developed exclusively within closed European seminars and private university journals. It sounded like a reasonable academic suggestion on the surface, but in reality, it was a cold, deliberate maneuver to ensure that no self-taught mathematician without access to elite, restricted university libraries could possibly understand the terms of the problem. The afternoon sun shifted across the high stained glass windows of the lecture hall, casting long, dusty, amber shadows across the slate chalkboards. While the audience buzzed with conversation during the intermission, Clara Sullivan remained seated in the front row, staring straight ahead at her worn, leather-bound notebook. She could feel the collective weight of 300 pairs of eyes pressing into her back. To the young men surrounding her in their tailored wool suits, this competition was a prestigious sport, a chance to win a published commendation and advance an already secure career. To Clara, every chalk mark was a matter of survival. She knew that if she stumbled once, her failure would not be treated as a simple personal loss. It would be used by men like Arthur Pendleton to validate the exclusion of every person who looked like her. Sitting 3 seats away, Julian Brooks adjusted his silk necktie and dusted a trace of chalk from his cuff. He glanced sideways at Clara's mended cotton dress and her simple wooden pencil box. His mind was still racing from round 1. He had spent 4 years studying advanced matrix theory under Pendleton's direct supervision, yet this unknown woman from Virginia had dismantled the problem in 5 minutes, using a structural shortcut he had never seen in any textbook. It unnerved him deeply, not merely because he had been outpaced, but because it challenged his entire belief system regarding who possessed real academic talent. At 3:20, Arthur Pendleton walked back onto the raised wooden platform. His expression was cool, unreadable, and completely composed. He raised a hand to quiet the auditorium and picked up a thick piece of white chalk. "For round 2, he announced, his voice echoing authoritatively off the high plaster ceiling, "we shall test the candidate's grasp of fundamental structural topology. The problem involves proving a specific connectivity property across a set of generalized non-Euclidean graphs." Pendleton turned to the slate board and began writing out the formal mathematical proposition. The equations spanned 3 long lines across the dark stone. Below the final variable, he wrote the command, "Prove the following statement." The official timer was set for 10 minutes. As soon as Pendleton stepped aside, the remaining 8 contestants seized their chalk and began working furiously. The sound of rapid, rhythmic scratching filled the silent hall. Julian Brooks immediately went to work, executing a standard direct proof technique derived from German topological treatises. Across the front row, 2 other doctoral candidates from Ivy League institutions began constructing elaborate induction models, filling their individual boards with complex logical expansions. Clara did not touch her chalk. She stood motionless before her section of the slate board, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her dark eyes fixed on the second line of Pendleton's proposition. 90 seconds passed, then 2 minutes. In the gallery, a soft rustle of murmurs began to grow. A young scholar leaning against the back wall whispered to his companion that the Virginia girl had finally hit her limit. Arthur Pendleton stood near the judge's table with his arms folded, watching Clara with a subtle, triumphant satisfaction. He believed her silence was the natural paralysis of an amateur confronted with advanced theoretical concepts, but Clara was not paralyzed. She was performing a rigorous structural analysis in her head. As she traced the hypothetical connections of the generalized graph through the second line, her intuitive grasp of spatial geometry caught a subtle, irreconcilable contradiction. The proposition looked entirely sound on the surface, written in Pendleton's elegant, flawless hand, but beneath the notation, the underlying structural logic contained a fatal flaw. Pendleton had framed the problem as a universal rule, but Clara realized that if you built a specific, tightly constrained network, a tiny 6-node graph with a deliberate pattern of cross-linked edges, the entire theoretical premise collapsed. She was not staring at a proof to be completed. She was staring at a trap. The statement was fundamentally false. Everyone else in the room was burning through their precious time trying to construct a logical road to a destination that did not exist. They were trying to prove a falsehood because a famous department chair had told them it was true. Clara picked up her chalk. She did not write out lines of long algebraic derivations. Instead, she drew 6 clean, precise dots in a circular pattern on the slate. With swift, confident strokes, she connected the vertices with a specific set of solid and dashed lines, creating her 6-node counterexample graph. Below the diagram, she wrote 3 lines of simple combinatorial logic, demonstrating that the graph satisfied every condition of Pendleton's premise while contradicting his conclusion. She stepped back, turned to face the judge's table, and laid her chalk down. "This statement is false," Clara declared in a clear, resonant voice. "Here is the counterexample." A sudden, cold stillness fell over the entire hall. The judges stared at her board. Julian Brooks stopped mid-sentence in his own derivation, his chalk freezing against the stone. He looked from his elaborate half-finished proof over to Clara's 6-node diagram. His eyes widened as his mind rapidly processed the structural logic. He recalculated the edge connections in his head, once, twice, 3 times. His hand slowly dropped to his side. She was right. The proposition was impossible. Professor Eleanor King rose from her seat at the judging table and stepped closer to Clara's board. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, examining every edge and vertex in Clara's diagram with sharp, methodical precision. After a long, silent moment, Eleanor turned toward her fellow judges and nodded once. "The counterexample is absolute," Eleanor announced firmly. "The original proposition is invalid." 3 of the 6 remaining male contestants were eliminated on the spot. They had spent their entire 10 minutes attempting to prove a false statement, trapped by their own blind obedience to authority. Only Clara, Julian Brooks, and a senior candidate from Columbia survived into the next bracket. Julian had survived merely because his partial work had correctly identified an inconsistency before time expired, though he had failed to produce a complete counterexample. As the judges returned to their table to tally the official scores for round 2, an invisible, sinister maneuver took place. Pendleton stepped up to the scoring ledger, leaning over the table under the guise of reviewing the criteria. The judge, presiding over the physical paper ledger, an elderly colleague loyal to the Pendleton family, I had initially recorded a 98 for Clara's round, a nearly perfect score for identifying the conceptual trap in under 2 minutes. Pendleton quietly rested his hand on the wooden ledger, his finger pointing to the entry. In a low, hurried whisper that did not reach Eleanor King's ears, Pendleton insisted that her presentation lacked formal academic exposition and demanded a deduction for brevity. With a swift stroke of an ink pen, the number on the official tally sheet was altered from 98 down to 91. 7 vital points were quietly erased from her record before the results were read aloud to the room. When the clerk announced the scores, Clara heard her total of 91. A faint, puzzled line appeared between her brows. She knew the scoring rubric inside and out. A flawless counterexample delivered in under 3 minutes should have yielded a higher score. But she had no access to the physical ledger, no proof of tampering, and no voice to challenge the administrative panel. She simply pressed her lips together, swallowed the quiet injustice, and turned her focus toward the upcoming semi-final round. Meanwhile, across the country, the unexpected events inside the university auditorium were beginning to ripple outward. During the midday break, a visiting journalist from the Boston Traveler, who had been sitting in the gallery to cover the annual academic gathering, had dispatched an urgent telegraph to his regional editor. The wire detailed how an unknown black woman from Virginia, possessing no formal institutional standing, was systematically outperforming the finest university minds in the country. By 4 o'clock, the word of the competition had reached academic circles in Boston and Philadelphia. Outside the Grand Hall, small groups of local black residents, workers, and community leaders, informed by word of mouth through Isaac Fisher and the local segregated lodging networks, began quietly gathering along the stone steps of the building, waiting in silent solidarity to hear the outcome of each round. Back inside, Arthur Pendleton prepared the board for round 3. The tension in the room was now thick enough to feel physically. The initial patronizing amusement of the audience had completely evaporated, replaced by an intense, nervous fascination. The department chair walked to the center of the stage, his face grim, his posture rigid. "For round 3, he announced, his tone cold and sharp, "the problem will require resolving a complex optimization model involving independent sets in higher dimensional topologies. The time limit is strictly 3 minutes. 3 minutes was a brutal, almost cruel constraint for a problem of such theoretical depth. It was designed to force panic and test raw processing speed." The clock began. Julian Brooks and the Columbia candidate dove into the problem instantly, their chalk moving at a frantic, desperate pace as they attempted to calculate the maximum independent set through standard iterative reduction. Clara stood before her slate, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the structure of the complex network. She knew that calculating the independent set directly in 3 minutes through brute force reduction was a mathematical trap. The arithmetic would consume every second. Instead of attacking the problem head-on, Clara mentally inverted the entire structure. She drew the complement of the graph, a dual representation where every existing connection became an open space and every open space became a solid connection. By transforming the independent set problem into a maximum clique problem on the complementary graph, she rendered the complex topology instantly visual. With effortless precision, Clara identified the maximum clique on her dual graph, mapped the result back to the original structure, and wrote down the definitive numerical solution. She placed her chalk back in the tray with 45 seconds still remaining on the master clock. When the master clock struck 0, Julian Brooks was still writing his final calculation, his hand shaking slightly as he pressed the chalk into the board. The candidate from Columbia had failed to complete his final reduction altogether. The judges rose to examine the 3 slates. Clara's solution was pristine, derived through her dual graph mapping, and completely accurate. Julian's result was also mathematically correct, but his long brute force method had consumed every single fraction of a second available to him. The Columbia candidate was officially eliminated. The original 12 contestants had been winnowed down to just 2. The final round of the Pendleton Distinguished Challenge would be a head-to-head showdown between Julian Brooks, the prized doctoral student born into generational wealth and trained in elite academic halls, and Clara Sullivan, the daughter of Virginia sharecroppers who had mastered advanced mathematics on scrapwood and discarded paper. The atmosphere in the lecture hall transformed from academic curiosity into a tense, polarizing spectacle. As the audience dispersed into the grand corridors for an extended evening recess, the story was already breaking out of the university walls. The telegram sent by the Boston Traveler reporter had spread quickly through regional press wires. By late afternoon, several local newspapermen had arrived at the campus gates, seeking permission to enter the building. Word had also reached the working-class black neighborhood on the west side of the city. More people were now gathering outside the stone pillars of the lecture hall: railroad porters, domestic workers, shopkeepers, and young students from local segregated schools, standing quietly in the chilly evening air, waiting to witness an event that felt far larger than a university contest. In the dim hallway outside the main auditorium, Clara sat on a simple wooden bench, nursing a small cup of water provided by Isaac Fisher. Isaac, the elderly black porter who maintained the segregated boarding house where Clara was staying, stood nearby with his broom, keeping a watchful eye on the passing scholars. He leaned in slightly, his voice a low, reassuring murmur amidst the echoes of the grand corridor. "You are holding your head high, Miss Clara," Isaac said quietly. "The whole city is talking about what is happening in this room tonight." Clara looked down at her worn leather notebook resting on her knees. Her fingers traced the frayed stitching along its spine. "I did not come here to make a point about the city, Mr. Fisher," she whispered softly. "I came because I spent 3 years writing letters to universities, and every single one told me I did not belong in their halls. I came to prove that the numbers do not belong to them either." Isaac gave a gentle, knowing nod. "They think they own the building, child, but they do not own the truth. Keep your footing." While Clara rested in the corridor, a far more sinister meeting was taking place in Arthur Pendleton's private office on the 2nd floor. Pendleton stood behind his massive mahogany desk, his face pale with suppressed fury, staring out the tall, narrow window at the growing crowd gathered on the campus lawn below. Standing across from him were 2 members of the administrative board and the department clerk who maintained the physical scoring ledgers. Pendleton turned abruptly, his voice a sharp, harsh whisper. "This cannot end with an unaccredited auditor winning the family lecture series," he said, slamming his hand onto the desk. "It will dismantle the prestige of this department. It will make a mockery of our entire doctoral program in every newspaper from Boston to New York." The senior administrator adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Arthur, her work has been flawless. Eleanor King is sitting at that judge's table, and she is watching every mark on those boards. If we attempt a blatant disqualification, King will expose it to the press, and the scandal will ruin the university's reputation, far worse than losing a competition." Pendleton's eyes narrowed into cold, calculating slits. "Then we do not disqualify her explicitly," he said quietly. "We select a problem for the final round, that she cannot possibly solve a problem, built upon theoretical concepts that have never been published in any textbook, journal, or public lecture." The administrator frowned. "What kind of problem?" "The proof from my private manuscript," Pendleton replied, a cold, ruthless smile creeping onto his lips. "The higher dimensional boundary mapping theorem I have been developing in my private senior seminar for the past 18 months. Julian has spent 2 semesters working through those derivations under my direct instruction. He knows the underlying lemmas by heart. The Virginia girl has never seen the notation, let alone the proof structure. It will look like a fair, highly advanced problem to the judges, but she will be staring at a wall she cannot scale. The clerk hesitated, shuffling the papers in his hands. And what of her score from round 2, Professor? The discrepancy on the ledger. Leave the ledger as it is for now, Pendleton ordered sharply. Once Julian wins the final round outright, no one will care about a 7-point variance in an earlier bracket. Prepare the board for the final match. Down in the corridor, the heavy brass doors of the auditorium swung open once again. The audience began filing back into their seats, the noise of 300 voices echoing through the grand space. Eleanor King walked down the center aisle toward the judges' table, her sharp eyes taking in the subtle shifts in the room. She noticed Pendleton conferring in hushed tones with the department clerk near the stage, slipping a sealed piece of paper onto the judges' podium. Eleanor's intuition flared instantly. She knew the history of elite academic institutions all too well. She knew the invisible, desperate measures men like Pendleton would employ when their unearned superiority was threatened. She pulled her private ledger from her purse and sat down, determined not to let a single detail escape her notice. At 5 o'clock precisely, Clara Sullivan and Julian Brooks walked onto the stage together and took their positions at 2 large, adjacent slate chalkboards. The entire hall grew so silent that the ticking of the grandfather clock at the back of the room sounded like a steady hammer fall. Julian looked across at Clara. His face was pale, his jaw set tightly. He was torn between his intense desire to win the prestigious series and an uncomfortable, growing awareness that the contest was being quietly manipulated to favor him. But he pushed the thought aside, convincing himself that his years of hard work entitled him to victory. Professor Arthur Pendleton stepped to the center of the stage, holding a fresh piece of long white chalk. He looked at the 2 contestants, his expression a mask of cold, professional detachment. For the final round, Pendleton announced, his voice carrying to the highest rafters of the gallery, the 2 remaining candidates will be required to construct a complete, rigorous proof for a boundary mapping theorem in higher dimensional topological spaces. This is a problem of supreme theoretical difficulty. You will have exactly 20 minutes. Pendleton turned to the slateboard and began writing the complex theorem. Line after line of rare, non-standard mathematical notation filled the dark stone. It was a dense, intricate array of specialized operators and custom boundary conditions, the very notation he had developed exclusively within his private, invite-only seminar. When Pendleton finished writing, he stepped back and looked at Clara. The trap had been laid. The timer began to count down. Julian Brooks immediately raised his chalk and began writing with fluent, practiced speed. He recognized the theorem instantly. It was the exact boundary mapping he had spent 3 months analyzing in Pendleton's private laboratory. The derivations flowed from his hand without hesitation, line by line, step by step. Clara stood before her board, her chalk resting motionless in her hand. She stared at the dense array of unfamiliar symbols. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She searched her memory, every textbook she had ever salvaged, from segregated school dumpsters, every MIT lecture outline she had memorized, every charcoal calculation she had drawn on scrapwood in Virginia. None of them contained this notation. The symbols were alien, designed specifically to lock her out. In the 3rd row of the gallery, several white students began to whisper and smile. Bradley Chambers leaned over to his companion, muttering softly, "Look at her. She does not even know where to begin. The magic is over." Pendleton stood near the judge's table, with his hands clasped behind his back, a quiet, cruel satisfaction radiating from his posture. He watched Clara stand frozen before the board, believing he had finally restored the natural order of his world. But sitting at the judge's table, Eleanor King adjusted her glasses and leaned forward, her eyes scanning the complex notation on the main board. She recognized the unique operator structures from a private draft Pendleton had circulated to select department heads a year prior. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She realized instantly what Pendleton had done. He had set a final exam based on his own private, unpublished work, giving his personal student an insurmountable, dishonest advantage. Eleanor quietly pulled out her pad and wrote a swift, firm note to the senior judge sitting beside her. "This problem is derived from Pendleton's unpublished seminar draft. It is an unethical selection." The senior judge read the note, frowned, but offered no response, keeping his eyes glued to the stage. 5 minutes passed. Julian Brooks was already through the first third of the proof, his chalk clicking in a steady, confident rhythm. His board was filling with neat, elegant lines of standard seminar logic. Clara was still standing still. Cold sweat formed at the back of her neck. The sheer injustice of the moment threatened to overwhelm her. She had traveled 4 days in a cramped, coal-dusted train car, starved herself on cold biscuits, and endured endless racial insults, only to be defeated not by her own intellectual limits, but by a rigged game designed in a private room she was never permitted to enter. Clara closed her eyes for 3 deep, silent seconds. The loud, rhythmic clicking of Julian Brooks's chalk across his slate sounded like the ticking of an unstoppable clock. 8 minutes had already elapsed out of the 20 allotted for the final round. The vast audience sat in breathless anticipation, watching Julian fill line after line with the smooth, familiar derivations he had practiced in Arthur Pendleton's elite, invitation-only seminar. From the front row of the gallery, Bradley Chambers leaned over to his companion, whispering with quiet arrogance that the Virginia woman had finally hit her ceiling, that self-taught intuition could never match the rigor of formal university training. Arthur Pendleton stood near the judge's table, with his arms folded across his chest, his face a mask of cold, triumphant serenity. He believed the natural order of his world had been permanently restored. Inside her mind, Clara tuned out the whispers, the ticking clock, and the heavy atmosphere of hostility. She looked at the strange custom operators Pendleton had written on the board. They were designed to lock her out, but mathematics was not a set of arbitrary symbols invented by a department chair. It was an absolute language of fundamental relationships. Clara realized that she did not need to know Pendleton's private notation to solve the problem. She needed to look past his custom symbols and identify the raw, universal structure underneath them. She opened her eyes, picked up her piece of chalk, and stepped up to her slate. She did not attempt to copy Julian's path. She did not try to reverse engineer Pendleton's private seminar lemmas. Instead, she took the underlying higher dimensional boundary conditions and completely reframed them using her own geometric intuition. She drew a new, original auxiliary mapping, a brilliant structural bridge that connected the non-standard topological spaces directly to standard combinatorial graph theory. It was a leap of pure creative logic that no textbook had ever recorded, a method born from 10,000 hours of solving advanced equations alone by the light of a single kerosene lamp in a rural cabin. Her chalk began to move. It did not click in short, nervous bursts. It glided across the dark slate in long, sweeping, confident strokes. Line 1 established her original mapping. Line 2 established a rigorous bidirectional equivalence. By line 4, she had completely bypassed the 30 tedious, complex algebraic derivations that Julian was currently struggling through. She was building a brand new highway straight through a mountain that Pendleton thought was impassable. The shift in the room was instant and profound. Professor Eleanor King leaned forward. So far her chair creaked softly, her sharp eyes tracing Clara's original auxiliary construction line by line. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had spent decades reading mathematical literature from across the globe, and she was watching a 22-year-old black woman invent an entirely new, breathtakingly elegant proof method in real time under extreme pressure. Next to Eleanor, the senior judges pulled off their spectacles, leaning closer to the board. Their faces pale with shock as they realized that Clara's path was not merely working. It was far simpler, more direct, and infinitely more profound than the method Pendleton had spent 18 months developing in his private lab. Julian Brooks happened to glance sideways to check his opponent's progress, expecting to see a blank slate or a mess of confused calculations. Instead, he saw Clara's auxiliary graph taking shape. Julian was a brilliant mathematician in his own right, and as his eyes scanned her third and fourth lines, the sheer genius of her method hit him like a physical blow. He stopped writing. His chalk hand dropped to his side. He realized instantly that while he was performing a memorized recipe handed to him by his professor, Clara was creating pure, revolutionary mathematics before his very eyes. His own elaborate 30-line proof suddenly looked clunky, derivative, and obsolete. With 2 minutes remaining on the master clock, Clara reached the bottom right corner of her slate. Board space was running out, so she wrote her final, decisive bounding equation in small, impeccably clear numbers near the bottom edge. She stepped back, turned to face the judge's table, and set her chalk down in the wooden tray. She had completed the full, rigorous proof with 120 seconds to spare. The master clock struck 20 minutes, its heavy chime ringing out through the silent auditorium. Arthur Pendleton instantly stepped forward from the side of the stage. His stride was rapid, deliberate, and aggressive. He positioned his tall, the wide frame directly in front of Clara's slateboard, specifically standing right in front of the bottom right corner, where her final bounding line was written, and faced the audience with an authoritative frown. "Time has expired," Pendleton announced, his voice booming across the hall to cut off any immediate reaction. "Mr. Brooks has completed his presentation using our standard university framework. Regrettably, as you can clearly observe from the main body of her board, Miss Sullivan's work appears incomplete. She ran out of space before reaching a definitive conclusion. Therefore, the final round is awarded to Mr. Brooks." From the audience's angle, Pendleton's broad back completely obscured the bottom right corner of Clara's board. The crowd could see her large auxiliary diagram and her preliminary equations, but the crucial final line remained totally hidden behind the department chair's body. A murmur of disappointment swept through the back rows. Several white students in the front row began to applaud, assuming the contest was officially over. Julian Brooks stood motionless beside his board, looking deeply uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on the floor. Clara stood at the side of the stage, her posture straight, her face an unreadable mask of absolute calm. She did not argue, she did not raise her voice, and she did not beg. She simply stood her ground and waited. Up at the judges' table, Eleanor King felt a surge of cold anger. She had been watching Clara's chalk hand until the very last second. She knew with absolute certainty that the final line had been written before the chime sounded. Eleanor rose from her chair, her wooden purse snapping shut with a sharp, echoing crack that cut through the polite applause like a pistol shot. "Professor Pendleton," Eleanor's voice echoed across the quieted hall, clear, command-filled, and carrying the unyielding authority of her decades at Howard University. "Before any final declaration or award is made, I demand my right as an official judge to inspect the candidate's board at close range." Pendleton blinked, his face flushing a deep, mottled red under the hanging brass lanterns. "Dr. King, the time has expired and the presentation is visually incomplete," he said quickly, his voice tight. "There is no need to delay the formal proceedings for an obvious—" "Humor me, Arthur," Eleanor interrupted smoothly, stepping out from behind the judge's table and walking directly toward the stage. The entire hall fell into a dead, absolute silence. 300 spectators sat frozen as Eleanor King walked up the wooden steps of the stage, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. Pendleton stood his ground for 2 tense seconds, attempting to maintain his blocking posture. But under the direct, unblinking gaze of a world-renowned scholar, he had no choice but to step aside without admitting guilt. As Pendleton moved 3 feet to the left, the bottom right corner of Clara's slateboard was revealed to the entire auditorium. Eleanor leaned down, brought her face close to the stone, and traced the small, crisp numbers of the final bounding equation with her finger. She checked the logical transition from line 4 to line 5, verified the boundary constraints, and stepped back to face the audience. "The proof is not only complete," Eleanor declared, her voice ringing out to the highest rafters of the gallery. "It is flawless. Miss Sullivan completed her final step before the timer expired, written precisely in the lower right margin. Furthermore, her original auxiliary mapping is without question the most brilliant, creative, and elegant piece of mathematical exposition ever produced on this stage." For 1 second, the room remained suspended in absolute shock as 300 minds processed the revelation. Then, the auditorium exploded into an uproar. It did not start with polite applause. It erupted as a sudden, sharp gasp that swept across the center rows, followed by a surging wave of excited voices that filled the high-plastered rafters. Students stood up in their seats to get a better view of the lower right corner of the board. In the gallery, visiting scholars and local citizens who had gathered along the back walls began clapping, their enthusiasm spilling down into the main aisles. Julian Brooks stared at Clara's slate for a long, unblinking moment. The shock on his face slowly melted into an expression of profound, quiet reverence. He looked at Arthur Pendleton, whose face was pale and rigid, and then turned back to Clara. Julian stepped forward, extended his right hand, and began to applaud standing alone in front of his board. He was the first person in the student section to give her a standing ovation. At the judging table, Eleanor King picked up her fountain pen and formally signed the master tally sheet. "I move that the final round be awarded outright to Miss Clara Sullivan," Eleanor announced firmly, her voice carrying over the din of the room. "Her auxiliary mapping method is entirely original, completely rigorous, and far superior in both efficiency and mathematical elegance." The two senior judges sitting beside her looked at each other, examined the board one last time, and quietly nodded in agreement. The vote was 3-0. Unanimous. Clara Sullivan had officially won the Pendleton Distinguished Challenge. From the fifth row of the audience, Department Dean Thomas Wilson stood up slowly. He was a tall, stoic man who had watched the entire afternoon unfold with growing unease. He saw the journalists from regional newspapers scribbling frantically in their notebooks near the double doors. He saw the local townspeople standing in the gallery. He saw 300 students witnessing a blatant attempt by a senior professor to obscure a contestant's valid work. Thomas Wilson recognized that the university was standing on the precipice of a devastating public scandal if the institution appeared to tolerate academic dishonesty. Dean Wilson walked down the center aisle and stepped onto the wooden stage. He looked at Arthur Pendleton, whose jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched beneath his skin. "Professor Pendleton," Dean Wilson said in a low, resonant voice that captured the room's attention, "you will step aside." The dean turned to face the vast audience and raised his hands for quiet. The hall gradually settled into an intense, expectant silence. In the interest of preserving the absolute academic integrity of this university, Dean Wilson announced. His voice echoed clearly off the stone walls. "The final scores have been formally audited and verified by the judging panel. Miss Clara Sullivan is hereby declared the official champion of this year's Distinguished Applied Mathematics Challenge. Furthermore, in light of administrative irregularities brought to the Dean's office during these proceedings, the annual lecture series will be temporarily suspended pending a complete internal review by the Board of Trustees." A loud murmur rippled through the audience. Pendleton took a sharp, shallow breath, stepping forward to protest. "Thomas, you cannot simply suspend a family series that has operated for 30 years. "Silence, Arthur," Dean Wilson cut him off sharply, without looking at him. "You are relieved of your administrative duties as department chair, effective immediately. A formal inquiry will convene in the president's office on Monday morning." Every camera bulb in the hall flashed in rapid succession as press photographers captured the moment. The blinding white light illuminated Pendleton's gray, defeated face. The titan of Northern mathematics, who had spent 32 years ruling his department with absolute authority, stood stripped of his administrative power on the very stage named after his grandfather. His 32 years of unquestioned prestige had unraveled in less than an hour. Clara stood beside her board, her hands folded neatly in front of her mended cotton dress. She did not raise her arms in triumph, she did not cheer, and she did not gloat. She simply closed her eyes for 2 quiet seconds, taking a deep, steadying breath. When she opened her eyes, she did not look at Pendleton, nor did she look at the flashing press bulbs. She looked down at her slate board, tracing the lines of her auxiliary mapping with her eyes. The mathematics had never lied to her. It had remained pure and absolute through every insult, every closed door, and every attempt to erase her presence. Eleanor King walked over to Clara, placing a gentle, warm hand on her shoulder. "You fought a magnificent battle today, child," Eleanor said softly, her eyes glistening with quiet pride. "You brought the truth into a room that tried its best to stay blind." Clara looked at Eleanor and offered a small, tired, but genuine smile. "The door was never locked, Professor King," Clara whispered softly. "They just made us believe we did not have the key." As the lecture hall slowly emptied, people filed out into the chilly night air. The crowd of local black residents that had gathered on the stone steps outside greeted Clara with warm, respectful applause as she walked out into the courtyard accompanied by Isaac Fisher. Isaac carried her small cloth bag, his posture tall and proud as he walked alongside her through the iron gates of the campus. 2 days later, on a quiet Saturday morning, the grand lecture hall sat empty and silent. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, and thin rays of pale sunlight filtered through the dust motes in the air. Clara returned to the hall one last time to retrieve a small brass compass she had left on the gallery ledge during the opening round. When she walked down the silent center aisle, she noticed that she was not alone. Standing in front of the main slate board was Arthur Pendleton. He was dressed in a simple dark overcoat, his hair uncombed, looking remarkably older than he had 48 hours prior. His office on the second floor had already been cleared out, his private files reassigned, and his name removed from the department directory. Yet he stood there alone in the dim, empty room, staring fixedly at the bottom right corner of Clara's slate, where her original auxiliary proof remained unerased. He heard the soft thud of her leather shoes against the floorboards and turned around slowly. He looked at Clara for a long time, the heavy silence stretching between them across the empty rows of wooden seats. There were no judges now, no audience, no journalists, no press bulbs, and no institutional titles to protect him. He was simply an old man standing before a young woman whose intellect he had failed to comprehend. "Miss Sullivan," Pendleton spoke, his voice dry and raspy, lacking its former booming resonance. "The auxiliary mapping you constructed in the final round, where did you read that transformation?" Clara stopped in the center aisle, looking at him with steady, unblinking eyes. "I did not read it in any book, Professor Pendleton," she replied calmly. "I built it on a piece of scrap pine behind my mother's cabin because the standard methods in your textbooks were too inefficient to solve the problem in the dark." Pendleton turned his eyes back to the slateboard. He stared at her handwritten chalk lines for several long seconds, his breathing quiet and shallow. "Yes," he murmured softly, almost to himself. "I can see that now." It was not a formal apology. His pride was still too bruised to articulate a confession of personal wrongdoing, but it was something far more profound. It was an undeniable admission of her mathematical genius from a man who had built his career on denying her humanity. Clara picked up her brass compass from the gallery ledge, placed it neatly inside her cloth bag, and turned toward the heavy double doors. She walked out of the building without looking back, leaving Arthur Pendleton alone in the shadows of his empty kingdom. The following morning, Clara sat in the quiet parlor of Isaac Fisher's boarding house, packing her few belongings into her cotton travel bag. Eleanor King arrived carrying a thick, wax-sealed envelope bearing the official emblem of Howard University. Eleanor sat down beside her at the wooden table and placed the letter in Clara's hands. "This is a formal appointment to the research faculty at Howard. Clara," Eleanor said, her voice filled with deep warmth. "You will have your own office, your own research budget, and a full scholarship to complete your doctorate under our department chair, Dr. Elbert Frank Cox. You will never have to ask permission to enter a lecture hall again." Clara looked at the official document, her fingers lightly brushing over her name printed on the cream paper. She had received rejection letters from every elite Ivy League institution in the North, but sitting in that quiet parlor, she realized she no longer needed their validation. She would build her legacy at an institution that valued her mind from the start. That afternoon, Clara walked down to the train station, accompanied by Isaac Fisher and Eleanor King. The air was crisp and clear as the steam locomotive chugged along the platform, its dark smoke curling into the autumn sky. Clara boarded the train for her return journey home to Virginia. She walked past the modern passenger cars and took her seat near the window in the wooden Jim Crow section at the front of the train. As the steam engine pulled out of the station, rolling past the brick chimneys and iron gates of the city, Clara pulled her worn leather notebook from her cotton bag. She opened it to a fresh, blank page, picked up a soft graphite pencil, and began sketching out a new mathematical theorem. The wheels of the train clicked rhythmically against the steel tracks, carrying her forward into a world that would never be able to erase her again. The steam train rattled south across the iron bridges, spanning the Susquehanna River, its heavy iron wheels casting rhythmic vibrations through the wooden floorboards of the segregated Jim Crow coach. Cinders from the locomotive's smokestack danced past the smudged window pane, but Clara Sullivan barely noticed the soot settling on her dark wool shawl. Her lap held the worn leather journal her mother, Lydia Kennedy, had gifted her 3 years prior, a book whose once blank pages were now densely packed with intricate mathematical derivations, original topological proofs, and the newly sketched foundations of her higher dimensional mapping theorem. Beside her, sitting upright on the stiff wicker bench, sat Eleanor King. The senior scholar from Howard University adjusted her wool coat against the cold draft seeping through the window frame. She reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a freshly printed edition of the Baltimore Afro-American, unfolding the broadsheet so Clara could see the front page. Beneath a bold headline declaring "Truth Prevails in Cambridge Academic Showdown" stood a crisp photograph taken on the stage of the Grand Auditorium. The image captured the pivotal moment when Eleanor King had forced Arthur Pendleton to step aside, exposing the lower right corner of the slateboard where Clara's final bounding equation was written in small, unyielding chalk marks. The accompanying column detailed the complete collapse of the annual Pendleton Distinguished Lecture Series, the emergency session convened by University Dean Thomas Wilson, and the formal appointment of Clara Sullivan to the faculty at Howard University under Department Chair Jeremiah Cox. "Read that third paragraph, child," Eleanor said, her voice filled with a quiet, resolute warmth that cut through the train's mechanical roar. "The press is no longer calling your victory an anomaly. They are calling it a watershed moment for American mathematics." Clara scanned the newsprint, her dark eyes lingering on the text. The article noted that several prominent academic bodies, including the American Mathematical Society, had received formal petitions demanding an audit of historical scoring ledgers across regional university competitions. In Boston and Philadelphia, student groups were already referencing Clara's original auxiliary mapping in private study circles, bypassing the traditional European matrix methods that had dominated university curricula for generations. "It is not about the headline, Professor King," Clara said softly, closing the newspaper and setting it gently over her journal. "It is about making sure that when the next girl from Anacostia or rural Virginia sits down with a discarded textbook, she knows the formulas belong to her just as much as they belong to any scholar born into wealth." Eleanor offered a slow, knowing nod. "That work has already begun. When Jeremiah Cox received my telegraph detailing your proof, he immediately allocated 2 research desks in the main library for your higher dimensional topology seminar. You will not merely be teaching basic arithmetic, Clara. You will be training the next generation of doctoral candidates." As the train crossed the state line into Maryland, stopping briefly at segregated platforms where black porters and laborers nodded in quiet recognition toward Eleanor and Clara, news of the event continued to reverberate across the academic landscape of the Northeast. In his quiet, mahogany-paneled office in Cambridge, Dean Thomas Wilson sat behind a massive desk covered in stack after stack of official university correspondence. Across from him stood Wyatt Bennett, a senior member of the university's administrative board. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the crackle of burning oak logs in the hearth. "We have received 3 more letters this morning, Wyatt," Dean Wilson said, gesturing toward the papers on his desk. 2 from founding donors and 1 from the Regional Accreditation Committee. They are requesting a full written accounting of Arthur Pendleton's tenure as department chair." Wyatt Bennett adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, his brow furrowed with deep concern. "Has Arthur submitted his formal resignation yet, Thomas?" "He has no choice," Wilson replied flatly, picking up a pen to sign an administrative order. "His private manuscript has been withdrawn from publication by the university press. The department board met an hour ago and voted unanimously to strip his name from the lecture series. The annual tournament will henceforth be known as the University Open Seminar in Applied Mathematics, governed by an independent committee of external judges." Wyatt let out a long breath, looking out the narrow window toward the empty stone steps of the lecture hall. "And what of young Julian Brooks?" "Julian has acquitted himself with considerable honor," Wilson noted, his tone softening slightly. "He delivered a formal statement to the student newspaper yesterday morning, explicitly acknowledging that Miss Sullivan's proof was completely original and superior to his own. He has declined the secondary commended scholar title, stating that accepting an award derived from a rigged problem selection would compromise his integrity as a mathematician. He requested a transfer to study under visiting scholars in Chicago. While the old guard of the Northern academic establishment scrambled to repair their tarnished public standing, a very different scene was unfolding in the working-class community of Anacostia, just outside Washington. When the northbound train finally pulled into the station late that evening, the wooden platform was filled with people. Word had traveled fast through the network of railroad porters, church congregations, and local civic clubs organized by Isaac Fisher and Lydia Kennedy. Dozens of neighbors, local school teachers, shopkeepers, and young children holding hand-painted paper signs had gathered in the dim lantern light to welcome Clara home. As Clara stepped down from the iron stairs of the Jim Crow car, carrying her small cotton bag, her mother, Lydia Kennedy, pushed through the cheering crowd. Lydia's hands, calloused and worn from decades of working in tobacco fields and cleaning university offices, reached out to wrap her daughter in a fierce, trembling embrace. "You did it, Clara," Lydia whispered, her voice choking with tears as she held Clara's face in her hands. "You stood up in their grand hall and made them speak the truth." "I did not stand up alone, Mama," Clara replied softly, looking around at the sea of proud, smiling faces surrounding them on the platform. Every line I wrote on that board came from the books you bought with your hard work and the charcoal equations we drew on the cabin floor. Isaac Fisher stepped forward, tipping his woolen cap with a broad, beaming smile. Miss Clara, the local youth center has already set up 3 new slate boards in the study room. The children have been asking all morning if you will show them how to draw the auxiliary mapping graph you used in Cambridge. I will show them tomorrow after morning service, Mr. Fisher, Clara said, her voice filled with steady determination. We have a great deal of work to do. Late that night, in the quiet wooden cabin where Clara had spent her youth studying by the light of a single kerosene lamp, the fire crackled softly on the stone hearth. Clara sat at the small kitchen table, her worn leather notebook open before her. Across from her, Lydia was carefully pressing a dried flower between the pages of an old family Bible. Clara picked up her soft graphite pencil, looking at the complex equations she had derived during the long train ride home. She realized that her victory in Cambridge was not the end of a long journey, but the absolute beginning of a much larger mission. The institutional walls built by men like Arthur Pendleton had been designed to keep people out, to make them believe that elite scholarship was a privilege reserved for a select few. But logic, geometry, and the absolute laws of mathematics belonged to no single institution, no family lineage, and no privileged class. She touched the tip of her pencil to the paper and began writing out the introductory axioms for her first formal research paper, a paper she would publish under her own name through Howard University, dedicated to her mother and to every young mind working in the shadows of systemic exclusion. Outside the cabin window, the night sky was clear and vast, filled with countless stars shining brightly over the rolling hills of Virginia. Clara Sullivan looked up at the constellations, her mind mapping their spatial coordinates with effortless, elegant precision, knowing with absolute certainty that no door in the world could ever lock her out again. The autumn of 1933 brought a crisp, invigorating chill to the tree-lined avenues of Washington, District of Columbia. On the central quadrangle of Howard University, fallen maple leaves drifted across the red brick pathways where hundreds of young men and women walked with armfuls of heavy leather textbooks. Inside the hall of the mathematics department, the air smelled of floor wax, old paper, and fresh chalk dust. A brand new hand-painted wooden sign had been mounted beside the double doors of Lecture Hall 3, reading, Advanced Seminar in Higher Topological Mapping Professor Clara Sullivan. Inside the hall, every single wooden desk was occupied. Young scholars from across the region, many of whom had traveled from segregated southern high schools, trade institutes, and working-class communities, sat with open notebooks, their fountain pens poised over blank pages. Sitting in the front row was a 15-year-old girl from Richmond, holding a discarded calculus text with a mended spine, her eyes wide with focused intensity. Clara Sullivan stood at the wide slate chalkboard at the front of the room. She wore a simple, tailored dark navy dress, her dark hair pinned neatly back. In her right hand, she held a long piece of white chalk. Beside her stood Department Chair Jeremiah Cox, who had personally invited the university leadership, local community organizers, and press correspondents to attend the opening lecture of the new academic term. Jeremiah Cox stepped forward to address the crowded hall, his deep voice resounding off the plaster walls. 1 year ago, he began, looking out over the eager faces of the students. A young woman stood in the back gallery of an elite northern institution. She was told that her background, her dress, and her lineage barred her from contributing to the highest levels of mathematical science. But as every student in this room knows, the absolute laws of logic do not bow to human prejudice or instant tutelage. A warm, steady round of applause echoed through the room. Jeremiah turned to Clara with a look of profound, quiet respect. Today, we do not merely welcome a brilliant scholar to our faculty. We establish a new center of mathematical discovery, one where no door will ever be barred, and no mind will ever be dismissed. When the applause faded, Clara stepped up to the slateboard. She did not begin with a canned introductory speech, nor did she quote traditional European treatises. Instead, she picked up her chalk and drew a single, the elegant 6-node graph across the center of the dark stone, the very counterexample diagram she had used to dismantle Arthur Pendleton's flawed proposition in Cambridge. To understand higher topological mapping, Clara said, her voice clear, calm, and carrying an effortless, resonant authority, we must first unlearn the notion that a complex problem requires a convoluted path. Mathematics is not an instrument of exclusion. It is the ultimate language of absolute truth. If a formula is correct, no authority on earth can invalidate it. And if an approach is flawed, no pedigree can make it right. For the next 90 minutes, Clara led the class through the fundamental mechanics of her original auxiliary mapping. The students watched in rapt attention as she demonstrated how to transform seemingly impossible, higher-dimensional boundary problems into clear, visual network graphs. The sound of dozens of pens scratching rapidly across paper filled the room, a harmonious chorus of young minds, capturing a revolutionary method that was already transforming the landscape of American mathematics. Meanwhile, in Boston, the autumn had brought a far quieter, somber atmosphere to the older academic corridors. At the central headquarters of the Regional Mathematical Board, Dean Thomas Wilson met with Wyatt Bennett and several visiting trustees to review the final administrative reports regarding the former department chair. Arthur Pendleton had officially retired from public life, taking up residence in a quiet seaside cottage outside Ipswich. His once celebrated graduate textbook had been withdrawn from the official university syllabus, replaced by a newly revised curriculum that incorporated modern topological techniques developed at Howard and Chicago. The grand lecture series that had borne his family name for 3 decades was officially rededicated as the National Open Seminar in Applied Mathematics, governed by a diverse, independent panel of external scholars. In a quiet corner of the university library, Julian Brooks sat at a heavy oak study desk, packing his notebooks into a leather bag. He had officially accepted a research fellowship at the University of Chicago, choosing to leave the familiar confines of his undergraduate alma mater to pursue advanced work under scholars who embraced new, pioneering methodologies. Before leaving campus, Julian walked down the grand corridor of the main lecture hall, stopping for a moment to look at the empty stage where the final match had taken place. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket, a personal letter he had written to Clara Sullivan at Howard University. In the letter, Julian had formally thanked her for her brilliant exposition during the final round, noting that studying her original auxiliary proof had fundamentally changed his own approach to spatial geometry. He dropped the sealed letter into the brass mail chute beside the main archway, stepped out into the crisp autumn air, and walked away from the old hall without looking back. Back in Washington, as the afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shafts of light across the university quadrangle, Clara's opening lecture came to an official close. The students gathered around the front desk, asking eager questions about the next assignment, before reluctantly filing out into the corridor to join the bustling crowds on the campus lawn. Eleanor King walked down the center aisle, holding 2 freshly printed copies of the American Journal of Mathematics. She laid them gently on Clara's desk. "Your paper on non-Euclidean auxiliary transformations has been officially accepted for the winter issue, Clara," Eleanor said, a proud smile gracing her lips. The editorial board approved it without a single revision. Clara looked at her name printed at the top of the manuscript page. By Professor Clara Sullivan, Department of Mathematics, Howard University. She thought back to the cramped, coal-dusted Jim Crow car. She thought of the cold biscuits eaten in a drafty boarding house. She thought of the condescending whispers from the front rows of the grand auditorium. And she thought of her mother, Lydia Kennedy, scrubbing floors so that her daughter could hold a discarded book. Every sacrifice, every insult, and every closed door had been met with the unyielding, quiet power of pure, undeniable truth. The men who believed they owned the institutions had tried to erase her presence, but in doing so, they had only exposed the rotten foundation of their own arrogance. Lydia Kennedy walked quietly into the back of the lecture hall, carrying a small basket of fresh apples from the local market. She stood near the doorway, watching her daughter pack her chalk box and gather her research papers. Clara looked up, caught her mother's eye, and offered a deep, luminous smile. They walked out of the hall together, stepping through the tall double doors onto the sunlit stone steps of the building. Below them, dozens of young students were gathered around the outdoor slate boards on the quadrangle, drawing geometric graphs, discussing equations, and working through derivations under the open autumn sky. Clara Sullivan stood on the top step, breathing in the cool, sweet evening air. She held her leather notebook firmly under her arm, her posture tall, her footing absolute, knowing that the doors she had opened would remain wide open for every generation yet to come.